right. Thank you, everyone, for coming today. My name is Jett. I'm a correspondent for governor here at the FCC. And before we get started, just a couple of reminders. Please silence your phones. Also wanted to briefly mention, in case you know anyone who is interested in joining the FCC or has ever mentioned it idly, this is a very good time to join. Our joining fees are about to go up, and we've extended the current joining fees for another 2 weeks. So if you do know anyone who is thinking about joining, please encourage them to apply before February 15th, because after that, joining fees will go up in all categories. So for today, we're very happy, we're very pleased to have Dr. Michael Ng from the Faculty of Law at the University of Hong Kong, where he's an associate professor. He is a legal historian focusing on the legal history of modern China and Hong Kong. And his most recent book, which we'll be discussing today, is called Political Censorship in British Hong Kong. So he will be discussing the book first, and then we'll have a question and answer section afterwards. So thank you all very much, and please go ahead.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Jennifer. Thanks, Mr. Liu Qiming, and thanks, FCC, for having me. I'm very happy and privileged to be able to share my latest book published recently on this topic with you. This is a book, this is a result of my archival research for the last 5 to 6 years, which basically study one question. Okay. The question is, where did Hong Kong's freedom of speech come from? So for a lot of you, or for certain sectors of the public, or perhaps for some historians, political scientists, especially legal professionals, this question seems to be quite simple. It's not worth asking. It comes from, the freedom of speech, of course, comes from the English rule of law principles, the common law values, or the English or British legal system. Or for certain members of the public, it came from the legacy of colonial rule. So perhaps that's why we saw these many colonial flags being waved in recent protests and social movements. This book disagrees with that. This book tries to draw on archival documents to debunk that, what I call conventional misperception or myth about where our freedom of speech came from. So in fact, this book is trying to reveal that Hong Kong society, especially the media and education sectors, were pervasively politically censored, prosecuted for at least 130 years of the colonial rule until the last 20 years. And this book tries to argue that what defined and confined what can be spoken about in Hong Kong is not so much about how dearly the common law values were held together. It's about the outcome of geopolitical rivalry of China, between China and other world powers, including the US, UK, Japan, as well as about the changing China strategies those world powers were using towards China during the 150 years colonial history of Hong Kong. So this is a table of content of the book. This book is organized chronologically. For the first 4 chapters, it will tell you how in the first 130 years, Hong Kong society, especially the press, the media sector, and the education sectors were pervasively politically censored, monitored, and sometimes prosecuted. And for the last 2 years, we feature a 180 degrees change in the attitude of colonial government towards educators and media workers in Hong Kong in the last, more or less 20 years before Hong Kong was handed back to China. So this book has, to me, 2 distinctive features. Number one is completely archival based. It's entirely based on declassified archival documents, some of which have never been brought to light, that I collected for the past few years from the UK's National Archives, from Hong Kong's Public Records Office, from Singapore's National Archives, and also other personal collections of retired newspaper editors, etc. The The second feature is that it positions the history of Hong Kong not as a history of a small city in Asia, but also as an important chapters of the British history of colonizations and decolonizations, as well as an important episode of Chinese history in its actions and counteractions in global politics. So in the next 10 to 15 minutes, I'm going to share with you some of the archival images and documents that I collected from archives to hopefully have a very accelerated walkthrough of the journey where Hong Kong transformed from a city of broken freedoms to a city whose freedoms were globally praised, at least at the time when Hong Kong was handed back to China. So this is newspaper clippings of the 19th centuries, 1850s. So it's about the chief editor of Hong Kong Daily Press, once the major English newspapers in Hong Kong in the 19th century, called Mr. Merrill. He was prosecuted for reporting politically undesirable reports, which is about a contract being awarded to a trading firm where the governor's son was a partner. Obviously, this report is politically undesirable, crossing political red line, and he was prosecuted, imprisoned, and fined under the common law offense of seditious libel. So you can see where the political red line was drawn from these reports. This is a confidential report from the governor in the 1880s, writing to colonial office in London, reporting criminal proceedings to be instituted against editors of 4 Chinese newspapers, 2 of which were mainstream Chinese newspapers back then, one of which called 華字日報, maybe some of you heard of that, and 循環日報, for what kind of politically undesirable reports? Because they reported some kind of imperial edict by the Chinese government asking Chinese people to race against the French during Sino-French War. So you can see that not only criticism against colonial government, but criticisms or attacks against European allies would be part of the political red line that the press should not cross, or they would be prosecuted. So that's 19th centuries, where I call the era of punitive censorship, where the colonial government would take criminal actions against those reported politically undesirable reports. Into the 20th centuries, I think this opening hours notice has never been brought to light. I collected from Ba Ling, a senior editor of 華僑日報, of course, who passed away, in his personal papers collections. It's about the opening hours of a secretive government office called Press Censorship Office, 香港報紙檢查處. I'm not sure how many of you have heard about this department under the Secretariat of Chinese Affairs. So it shows the opening hours from Monday to Friday, 2 p.m. to 6 p.m., 8 p.m. to 1 a.m., and Saturday, 2 to 4 p.m., 9 to 11 p.m., and Sunday, 4 to 6 p.m., and 8 to 1:30 a.m. Why is it opening only in the evening? Because it has the responsibility of reading all Chinese newspapers' manuscript proofs before they could go to print. So every press, in Hong Kong, the Chinese newspaper press, were ordered to send them the manuscript proofs for the Chinese censors in this office to read and vet, and they strike out disliked words and sentences and reports before those final proofs can go to the printer overnight. Hence, it operated in the evening and in the afternoon to fit the operation hours of the press. So, if you were the editors, if you send a manuscript to censored and they dislike the word, sentences, and report, without the help of Microsoft Office, how would you able to rearrange the layout? So you just couldn't do it. So you have to leave those disliked words blanks and replaced by symbols. So it's not uncommon in the 20s, 30s, and 40s for one to buy a newspapers in the street with reports with crosses, dots, and square boxes hiding over those disliked or censored words. This is a published version of newspapers sold in the streets. So it would be a really nice guessing game to see, what kind of political red lines the colonial government was imposing by guessing what the cross represented. So in these newspapers, the cross represented Japanese army, or Japan. So for those of you who are familiar with the geopolitics in the 30s or 20s, I think you heard of the Anglo-Japanese alliance and the subsequent ambiguous kind of appeasement diplomatic policies of Britain towards Japanese aggressions in China. So basically, colonial government in Hong Kong did not want Hong Kong to be a base of anti-Japanese sentiment. So they censored, struck off these words, and leave crosses. Sometimes it's not that easy to guess. If you read these newspaper reports, you would find that a lot of boxes, fake, place to be replaced. So I cannot guess what it meant. But you can tell this is not the front page. So you can tell that the censors really read into not only the front page, the headlines, but into subsequent pages. According to some court reports back in the 30s, the censors were mandated to read every line in every Chinese newspaper's manuscripts to make sure those undesirable reports and words will not appear. Some even more unfortunate, some journalists reported some news which is entirely politically undesirable, affected British Empire's geopolitical interest or colonial governance during the period they will be returned. Before those manuscripts returned, a big red cross will be drawn by those censored with a chopped in the middle. The chop is very important, and that formed the cover page of my book because I only got 2 precious original returned manuscripts, which says the outer circle of the chop says Hong Kong Press Censorship Office. The inner circle said this manuscript is banned from publishing. So I think this evidenced the actual day-to-day, on the ground, under broad daylight operations of the Press Censorship Office. So very ironic, one legislative councillor, Mr. Lo Wen-Gam, who was a trained lawyer, trained in London, Chinese legislative councillors, was asked by newspaper editors to make a motion in the Legislative Council asking for abolitions of this pre-vetting practice of Hong Kong government. Not only, of course, his motion declined, the newspaper reports that reported his petition or debate in the Legislative Council was severely censored. And his reasons for abolishing this censorship mechanism was replaced by dots. So fast forward into the Cold War period, after the World War II. There were 3 legislations which were very fearful in terms of, if I was working in the education sectors or in the media sectors, because these 3 legislations can enable the governor to take actions against media workers and educators for politically undesirable comments and reports or activities without going through the open court. One is called deportations. So deportations means if the governors, or solely the governors, consider someone politically undesirable, they could be deported unless he or she is a British subject, where most of the people in Hong Kong back then were not British subjects because they were not born in Hong Kong and they migrated from China. So the other very fearful law is about detention regulations, which if the governor considers someone to be undesirable politically, he could be detained for indefinite periods without trial. There were 2 famous detention centers in Hong Kong, one still kept in the Victoria Road, which is now used by University of Chicago as its Hong Kong campus, which has been operated by a special branch of Hong Kong police as the political detention centers. The other ones located in Tsim Sha Tsui East, ironically near a Hong Kong History Museum. Why in Tsim Sha Tsui East? Because it was so close to the train stations back then. And it was easy for someone to be deported back to China after being detained and interrogated. So So many educators, such as principal of Hermtold Middle Schools, Mr. Lo Tong, and major writers of Wen Wei Bao, Sima Men Sum, and many others, journalists and educators, were so deported back to China. We talked about school principals. Actually, this book is not only concerned about the press, it also concerns about education sectors or educators. I know many of you may be aware of the existence of special branch of police who is responsible for political surveillance and taking political actions against dissents. But I'm not sure whether you're aware of a similar organizations in education department. Actually, I think this is for the first time brought to light. There's a special bureau in the education department working closely with a special branch of police for censoring textbooks, vetting backgrounds of teachers and school principals, as well as monitoring political activities of especially leftist schools in Hong Kong. And also, if you look from this confidential memo, you can see that it has 3 aims: to study communist propaganda and education, to carry out counter-communist activities in schools and monitor the activities, as well as to work very closely with Special Branch of Hong Kong Police for vetting and censoring educators and education sectors. So I mentioned 2 legislation. This is the 3rd one, which I hope it will not be recycled soon, but it's called Control of Publications Ordinance, legislated in 1951, which empowered the governor and the government to shut down any press if they were suspected of publishing seditious headlines. So without going through any open court trial. So the famous one being in 1967, 3 leftist newspapers, including 天風日報, were raided and shut down, and journalists arrested in 1967's riots. You can see from the newspapers that police, armed police holding shotguns, raiding newspapers' office under the power given under the Control of Publications Ordinance, which was repealed in late 80s. So, of course, most of the cases, Hong Kong government took actions through administrative powers of censorship and arrest without going through the open court. But if they thought that an open court trial, although costly and lengthy, might give chilling effects to political activists, they might do so. 2 very famous open court trials under seditions ordinance. One is against Dai Gong Bo, which was being shut down in 1952, and the other, of course, against the 3 fringe leftist newspapers in 1967. So back to the press or media. So in the 60s, now we're in the 60s, fast forward. So we know that not only newspapers, but also electronic medias become major source of news and entertainment. We all know that RTHK was formed in 1928, and then followed by Rediffusion Radio, Rediffusion Cable TV, commercial radios in 50s and 60s, we have TVB. But I think not many of you, if you know, tell me, if you received those news manuscripts, tell me that for the first 40 years until early 70s, none of the electronic media had the power to write their own news stories for broadcasting. They have to request and receive news scripts from government information services for their newscasters to read. So everybody are reading the same news scripts received from the government information services. And the colonial government had the policy of strict control of the source of news and the news scripts. So this is the annual report of government information services. They did not shy away from acknowledging that they supply news scripts to those electronic media. And this is a reply letter from government information services to commercial radio agreeing to increase the supplies of news scripts according to the increased newscast of commercial radio based on their request. So it evidenced the supplies of news scripts on every cast of electronic broadcasting. Not only news. This is a memo from government censors a Chinese censor called Samuel Chan, sending a memo to controller of broadcasting, Guangbo Chuzhang, which is the head of RTHK, and has been copied to the Secretary of Chinese Affairs, saying that I have listened to all the gramophone records stored in RTHK. So none of them have political messages which were undesirable, except these 8 songs. So one of which that he particularly pointed out might be too sensitive. It's called Mun Gong Hong, Man Jiang Hong. It's a heroic stories of Song Dynasty, despite the fact that he explained, despite it's about Song Dynasty, but if it's misused, then it could be sensitive. So you can see how far the political red line could be stretched to, even in the 60s, against gramophone records. Everything began to change when this gentleman arrived as the governor of Hong Kong, because in this confidential memo, he was mandated to create a better, freer, and richer society of Hong Kong for the purpose of widening the gap of living standard between mainland China and Hong Kong, so as to increase the bargaining power for the British government in terms of negotiating for the future of Hong Kong 20 years later. So that formed the biggest context, or the bigger context, against the very, fondly remember social services reform, housing reform, education reform during the MacLeod period. And of course, and during the 70s, it was for the first time that the government reformed the government information services, allowed electronic media to collect and write their own news, and for the first time in Hong Kong history, it publicly stresses the importance of free speech and freedom of expressions and press freedoms. And all these, what I call the legal liberations or legal cleansing for China, accelerated, of course, after the signing of joint declarations. In the interest of time, so I'm not going to tell you why and how it happened after that, but I have to tell you that the draconian laws and measures that I mentioned has been repealed and canceled one by one, starting the mid-80s. So censorship laws are repealed. After Tiananmen, Hong Kong for the first time have the freedom of expressions being written on the statute book for the first time with the passing of the Bill of Rights Ordinance, despite the fact that the ICCPR, International Covenants for Political and Civil Rights, were supposed to be extended to Hong Kong in 1976. And of course, during the governorship of Chris Patten, the legal cleansing and legal liberations accelerated, and leaving, the chapter where we are having now. This is the farewell speech of Chris Patten. He says, the chapter ends, success story goes on. I think he meant the success stories, among other things, is about how the British administrations built a rule of law and free society for Hong Kong. That's his narrative. As a historian, after this research, my narrative would be the success story also lies in the fact that a colonial legacy was built by successfully erasing the marks of colonialism. So with that, I'm happy to take questions. But before that, if you are interested in more archival images, documents, feel free to use this barcode to purchase a copy of this book. Thanks very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll start off with a couple of questions, and then we'll open it up to the floor. When I was reading the book, it struck me, first of all, that a lot of this history is not really that long ago, and also how British colonial laws still affect Hong Kong even 25 years after the handover. And one that I wanted to ask you about is the sedition law, which has very much been in the news lately with the Stand News trial, among other cases. Can you tell us a little bit about the origins of that law, how it was used during British colonial times, and when it was last used, and also how it's being used now?
Thanks very much. Of course, personally, to me, it's quite sad, to see, things being recycled these days. But seditions law has a very interesting historical origins, actually. The first seditions law in Hong Kong, in terms of legislations, It was passed in 1914, which has a title of Seditious Publications Ordinance. Of course, Seditious Publications Ordinance had all these, funny, buzzword that we all fear today, like, hatred and contempt of government. So it appeared back then already. So the current Crimes Ordinance Section 9 actually recycled that part of those keywords and buzzwords, more than 100 years ago. But the interesting fact is that it was legislated not for the purpose of censoring or controlling local Chinese residents. It was for the purpose of targeting rebellious Indians, especially rebellious Indian police. So putting that into bigger geopolitical context, because into the 1910s and 20s, the British Empire was facing legitimacy issue, especially when the Garda movement was on the move. Garda movements, for those of you who know Indian history, is about Indian independence movements in all around Asia, along the British colonies in Asia. So, but remember, British colonies were policed mostly by Indians. So these, independence movement and subsequently combined with Indian communist movement, give a lot of fear and anxiety to the British colonial governments, all around Asia. So therefore, not only Hong Kong, but also Singapore, they put together seditious publications ordinance for the purpose of controlling circulations of Indian publications in Hong Kong. But of course, with the rise of Chinese communism and subsequent social unrest in Hong Kong, those laws were used to target local Hong Kong residents. And it becomes Seditions Ordinance enacted in 1938. And subsequently, it was incorporated into the Crimes Ordinance in the early 70s, but have not been so used until everyone knows, fairly recently. So in terms of the frequency of usage, I haven't done thorough statistical analysis, so don't hold me on that. But from my impression, it was not used so frequently if you compare with how it was used today. For practical reasons, okay, for practical reasons, because Hong Kong government did have other administrative measures to get rid of problem without bringing those guys to court under the Seditions Ordinance, unless for famous press that the colonial government would like to have chilling effects, like shutting down Dai Gong Bo, shutting down the 3 communist newspapers in 67 to have chilling effects to other activists. Otherwise, they would prefer to nip the Chinese problem in the bud by deporting them, retaining them, or by using some other administrative measures without publicizing the whole issues in the open court hearing. Hence, it was not so used frequently. The last use, if I remember correctly, tell me if I'm wrong, because some of you might have gone through those periods, would be the 67 riots, where sedition ordinance, sedition charges were brought against Tian Feng Yat Bo, Sun Wu Bo, and Gam Ye Bo, both, all of them leftist newspapers back then.
And the second thing I wanted to ask about, as you mentioned, towards the end of British rule, a lot of restrictive laws were repealed or unwound in some way, but not all of them were, and some of them are still around in whole or in part. And one of them is the Emergency Regulations Ordinance, and I wanted to ask you what happened with that under Governor Patton and how it was used by the government in 2019.
Well, I think there's a number of ordinance being kept despite the handover, which is, I think, subject to future research. Would be very interesting to research, when further declassified documents were open as to why and how they were selectively kept. One of which is the seditions provisions, the other of which is Emergency Regulations Ordinance. But the most interesting fact is that in the 90s, when the Emergency Regulations Ordinance were considered, the government decided to repeal all the regulations made under the Emergency Regulations Ordinance, but without the ordinance being repealed. That means the power, the widest power, okay, one of the widest power, if not the widest, among the British Empire, among all the colonies, to make rules and laws without regard or without scrutiny by the legislative branch. The emergency regulations in Hong Kong, they kept those power, but removed all the regulations made under those powers, despite the fact that emergency situations, did not exist for a lot of time in 80s, 90s, or even for most part of the 70s. So the regulations were there, and ordinance were there until 90s. Regulations were removed, but ordinance was kept. Hence, the post-colonial Hong Kong government had the power to enjoy those widest power in the history of colonial times to make regulations. And hence, we were made, cover our face, not cover our face, depending on the situation under the emergency regulations ordinance. But actually, the imagined power of the emergency regulations ordinance is much bigger than face covering if you read the legislation.
Do we have questions from the audience? Yes. Oh, and please identify yourselves and your organization, if any.
Hi, I'm Edith Terry, a former journalist, and have my own consultancy. I wanted to ask about international publications in Hong Kong. Just anecdotally, I have a woman friend who's a CEO of a major Taiwan company that when she was a teenager would visit and beyond would visit Hong Kong and collect international publications, Time, Newsweek, whatever, and take them back in secret to Taiwan, which had even stricter censorship. So one question is, how did this policy, how is these policies of control exercised on foreign publications, or even publications like the Far Eastern Economic Review, which was local, but basically the circulation was basically to basically international, written in English and so on. And there's sort of a corollary question or ancillary question to that, which is in Singapore, you frequently see their sedition laws exercised against foreign publications. Was that also, were there also instances in Hong Kong where the sedition law or libel laws were exercised against the publications that were in this foreign category?
Thanks very much. Actually, the book covered a little bit of that, but not all of that. Just now I mentioned a lot about Chinese press, but actually English press, especially SCMP, was also subject to political censorship, but in a different form. So they were not required to submit scripts for pre-vetting before printing, but they would receive occasionally letters from the governors, colonial secretaries about the kind of reports that you should consult the colonial secretary before reporting. The kind of affair, say for example, things about Indian communities, things about Chinese government, etc. So they would be communicated, okay, discreetly or openly. So I also feature some of the letters that the Hong Kong government sent to SCMP about this. Very good question about international press. I didn't do much about international press, but I did have archival documents featured in this book about how special branch of police talked to foreign media about the sensitivity of reporting something. Whether those media follow or not, I don't think I think it's quite beyond the control of colonial government, especially for international press community. But they would do some talking behind the scene to, say, for example, foreign radio broadcasters, foreign journalists, and sometimes they use refusal of work visa, which we are very familiar now, to exercise the chilling effect, which has been covered in the book too.
Other questions?
Thank you. My name is Louis Kuijs. I work for S&P Global. In many systems there are certain forms of censorship or rules, right? I'm just curious, from your research, you mentioned the SCMP, for instance. Would you say that was the SCMP able to criticize decisions with regard to the political affairs or economic affairs in Hong Kong, or did you find a lot of instances in which it became clear that it was not possible for the SCMP to do that? I'm just trying to get a sense of how we can relate what was the situation 4 decades ago with the current situation.
Thanks very much. I think we focus about how they were censored. But of course, as newspapers, you either shut down the newspapers or let it publish with censored words. Otherwise, they would be able to criticize to a certain extent if they are not overstepping the political red line set by the colonial government from time to time. So therefore, they were not only allowed, especially for English newspapers, they enjoy relatively better freedom to criticize the government. They even criticize the censorship regime. So they were allowed to do so. But they were also not allowed to do something politically or geopolitically more sensitive. So, remember, the aim of this book is not about, how free Hong Kong was. It's about where our freedom of speech came from. What's the driving force behind what can be spoken about, what cannot be. So in the geopolitical context behind the scene. But of course, newspapers could still be published. They can still criticize and comment, up to a certain extent. Thanks very much.
Other questions? Please.
Hi, Lee Williamson from Tatler. I'm also on the board here. It's one thing to have a vague concept that what you're reading has been censored. It's quite another to see that censorship in front of you. I can only imagine how frustrating and bizarre that must have been. I was wondering if you came across any anecdotal recollections of what that was like for the audience, for the reader, if there was any attempt to decipher what was being said, or indeed, in modern times, Chinese netizens on Weibo, for example, will use certain synonyms or certain words to mean certain things, like Tiananmen could be referred to as the 34th of June, and then when that word got clamped down, it was when spring turns to summer. Everyone knew what they were talking about. Was there any such thing back then when newspaper editors would know that certain characters would get censored, so they would use other characters to replace it, assuming the audience would understand? Thank you.
Thanks. Journalists have been always smart in terms of working around how to report the truth without being caught into trouble, hopefully. So therefore, you're right. There's some kind of things that they try to do in terms of working around the corner. But as the book mentioned, there's some sad stories that they were unsuccessful and were prosecuted and imprisoned at the end of the day. But at the same time, some of them were successful. Say, for example, they tried to replace the name of a country with animals. They tried to replace the name of the government officials with animals, where only very sophisticated Chinese reader could detect. So they tried to cut the corner, but not always successful.
Other questions? Is there anyone on? Oh, yes.
Yes, thank you, Ulrich Schröder. I'm a law professor based in Switzerland mostly. Thank you for your fascinating presentation that covers a very long time. What I'm interested in is mostly, you describe the law in the books, how it has evolved, but of course it matters a lot how a law, even if it's an old law, is actually being applied during different times. So could you say something about the censorship as it was actually exercised in Hong Kong, say post the 1960s, post 1967? And I have a second question. You mentioned that there may have been, or maybe I misunderstood that, a distinction between how British citizens were treated and non-British citizens, of which there were many in Hong Kong. Did that play out in any way in the way the censorships were in fact enacted? Did the British have more freedom than the foreigners who were living in Hong Kong?
Thanks very much. So actually, because in the interest of time, I just mentioned about those laws, but actually this book focused a lot on day-to-day, on-the-ground practice of the law. So it's not about a textual history of law. It's about how the law was practiced and not practiced, how they were censored and not censored. Say, for example, in the 60s, I talk about deportations and detention without trial. One of the things I mentioned is that how those guys were detained, why they were so deported. And the newspaper reporting their actual deportation, how they were carried to the train station and sent away. And at one point of time in the late 50s to early 60s, there were about 30,000 persons being detained in detention center in Hong Kong without trial. I think this is the evidence of the actual practice of detention without trial. So thanks very much for bringing about that, but I have a lot of examples of on the ground practice of these censorship measures and law in the book. In terms of British subjects, very interesting questions. I think London gave pressure to colonial government in terms of how to deal with British subjects, because they were not subject to deportation in general, although with some lengthy procedures, they could be invited to go away. Okay, but I think in terms of Europeans and British subjects, colonial government exercised extra cautions. So, but at the same time, they would also talk to those community behind the scene as to what should be reported and what should be talked about, with caution. But you're right. In terms of practice, it's more lenient, just like how censorship law applies to South China Morning Post versus Chinese newspapers.
Were there any questions in the back that I didn't see? No? Okay. I just wanted to ask you a little bit about, closer to handover time, just to talk a little bit about the British government strategy when it came to the Basic Law, what role it played or didn't play in that, and how its actions in Hong Kong were governed by that.
I think the Basic Law, the Joint Declaration of the Basic Law forms a very important context against which the legal liberations and legal cleansing process proceeded in the 80s and 90s. If you read archival documents, a lot of them are being opened up digitally in the UK. You would see British actions being held back sometimes by Beijing's reactions. So I think London was caught in the middle of trying to open up as far as it could in terms of the legal regulations of media and education sectors in Hong Kong, but at the same time without provoking Beijing's oppositions. I think the Bill of Rights Ordinance provided a very vivid examples on how, at what point of time that the London government took actions. Actually, the Bill of Rights Ordinance was on the shelf for more than 5-6 years before it was passed. It was actually formed in the middle of 80s. So there's a lot of internal debate within Hong Kong and London and Beijing. I mean, Beijing, the British representative in Beijing, not the Beijing government, as to whether Bill of Rights should be rolled out as part of the legal liberations. It was held back because of the potential Beijing oppositions until they find a very optimal moment, which was Tiananmen. Right after Tiananmen, in July 1989, Geoffrey Howe announced in the parliament that Bill of Rights Ordinance will be granted to Hong Kong. But actually the draft had been on the shelf for 5-6 years already because of diplomatic relations that it was not so passed to Hong Kong. So therefore there's a lot of push and pull before Margaret Thatcher stepped down, where she was assisted by, for a long period of time, what we call the China advisors, including Percy Craddock, including David Wilson, who, depends on how you, judge on that, who provided a lot of advice to Margaret Thatcher in terms of not to provoke. But all of these, accidentally disappeared because it was a surprise that, Thatcher stepped down and Major stepped up, and all these Chinese advisors were replaced, and Governor was replaced as well by Chris Patten, where, as we all know, potential Beijing opposition was not playing such a big part in his policy.
Oh, yes, we have a question here.
Hi, Tony Watson, Far East Investment Management. Just a point you made in that last response there about the Beijing government pushing back on the rights bill. To what extent were you able to source documentation from the mainland side about their interactions on the pushing for or against the censorship regulations that you discuss in your book throughout the time span of your book?
Thanks very much. Very good point. The short answer is I was not able to access to Chinese archival sources, but it doesn't mean that I don't have sources. I do have memoirs from former workers in the left wings and Chinese newspapers, newspaper reports as to the reported oppositions of Beijing, and to supplement what I got from the British archive, which said about the reactions in Beijing, so I can do some kind of weighting and balancing. But yeah, you're right. It's not easy for historians to get access to Chinese archives. So as a side note, it's quite sad as well, because for a lot of historians working on Hong Kong history, we are very happy to be able to work up to 1997, because we have a lot of archives declassified or to be declassified about discussions about the boss and people on the ground. That means London and Hong Kong. But imagine how are we able to get access to communications between post-colonial Hong Kong government and Beijing. So therefore, archival research on Hong Kong history might have to stop at 1997.
Oh, and I think we'll take our last question from Kim Ming.
Thank you. Liu Qinming, one of the governor of the FCC. If I read it correctly, one key reason the British were doing all this censoring was not to offend China. If that were the case, in your research, did you come across any communication between Peking at that time and London? Thank you.
Thanks very much, Kim. So for a lot of measures, so much so you see, how draconian it looked like. Actually, there's a lot of pullback from acting against the left wings or the right wings by taking into account whether it would upset the geopolitical equations in the regions or the British potential relations with Beijing in this era. Say, for example, you can imagine why in the 67 riots, those major left-wing newspapers like 文匯報, 大公報 was not prosecuted, but only the small fringe newspaper, 田豐日報, 金午報, 新晚報 were prosecuted. It's a political decision. It's a diplomatic decision. It's expressly deliberated in memos or correspondence between London, Beijing, and Beijing, I mean, British representative in Beijing and Hong Kong, talking about having chilling effect without upsetting Beijing this much. Otherwise, it would provoke retaliations for the British interest in China. So there's a lot of push and pull. And also you point out another very important point is that press censorship, film censorship, education censorship is not entirely targeting against the left wings, although the left wings would be the more frequent customers enjoying those measures. But also the KMT-backed schools, KMT Press, even the Voice of America was also subject to those measures, okay? Because not only the colonial government, not only it doesn't want Hong Kong to be a base of anti-American, anti-British sentiments, it also doesn't want Hong Kong to become a base of anti-communist or anti-American, political base. So Hong Kong was kind of stuck between. At the same time, it has large populations of Chinese residents, mainly which could be supporting mainland Chinese government back then in the Cold War period. At the same time, it has to follow the bigger global anti-communism solidarity between London and Washington. So how do they, play the ball, stopping the spreading of communism in Hong Kong and Asia, at the same time not affecting the so-called state security of the region. So it's quite a difficult balancing game. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Ng, for coming today. And the book is available online from Cambridge University Press. And we also have a gift for you from the FCC, a little souvenir.
Thanks so much.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much for joining me. Thank you so much.